She inherited a cabin at -80 in the frozen wasteland. Her relatives laughed until they saw the trut. It was a cold winter afternoon when Emily first received the letter. She had been sitting at her small kitchen table sipping coffee while working on her laptop when the thick envelope arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, and the return address looked strange, far from any place she had ever been. The letter was from a distant relative named Aunt Clara, someone Emily barely remembered. Clara was a woman who had lived alone in a remote part of the country, in a place so cold and isolated that Emily couldn't even picture it properly. The letter was short, but the message was clear. Aunt Clara had passed away, and she had left Emily her cabin. At first, Emily couldn't believe what she was reading. Her aunt, who had always been a mystery in the family, had left her a cabin in the middle of the frozen wasteland. What could possibly be there? What was the point of such a strange inheritance? She had never even met Aunt Clara in person, only heard odd stories from her parents about the woman who lived far away in the freezing cold. Emily sat back in her chair, feeling both confused and curious. She wondered why Clara had left the cabin to her and not to any of the relatives she was closer to. There were no details in the letter about what she would find when she arrived at the cabin, just a simple note saying that it was hers now, with instructions on how to reach it. Emily's first instinct was to call her parents. She needed some guidance, some reassurance that this wasn't some kind of joke. Her parents answered the phone, and she quickly told them about the letter. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before her mother spoke. "Well, I guess we never expected this," her mother said with a light laugh. "Aunt Clara always kept to herself, didn't she? But you've got to be kidding, right? A cabin in the middle of nowhere." Her father joined in, his voice full of disbelief. "Who in their right mind would live out there? It's too cold, too isolated. Are you really thinking about going?" Emily could hear the mockery in their voices. They didn't take her seriously. They didn't understand the pull she felt, the curiosity, the desire to know more about the woman who had chosen such a harsh life. The more they laughed, the more Emily felt like she needed to go and see the cabin for herself. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about something deeper. There was a connection, something she couldn't explain. Maybe Aunt Clara had known something about life out there that no one else did. Maybe it was time for Emily to discover that secret. Her relatives continued to laugh at the idea, offering their opinions on how foolish it was. They talked about how Emily, the city girl, was completely unprepared for the freezing cold, the harsh winds, and the isolation of the wasteland. They joked that she would be better off staying in her warm apartment where it was safe and familiar. Emily could practically hear the eye rolls over the phone. No one thought she could handle it. No one believed she would last a day out there. But something inside Emily told her that she needed to go. This wasn't just about proving a point to her family. It was about learning who Aunt Clara really was. If the cabin had meant something to her aunt, then maybe it could mean something to Emily, too. So after a few days of thinking it over, Emily made up her mind. She would go to the cabin. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this seemed like the ultimate test. Her relatives didn't believe in her, but she didn't need their approval. She needed to find her own answers. The next few days were spent preparing for the trip. Emily didn't know exactly what to bring. She had never been to a place like this before. She did some research online about cold weather survival and made a list of things she might need. Warm clothing, sleeping bags, food supplies, and tools for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it felt like the bare essentials for surviving in such an extreme environment. The relatives were unsupportive. They continued to mock her decision. "Don't say we didn't warn you," her cousin said on the phone, clearly amused by the thought of Emily trying to survive in such a place. "You're going to freeze to death out there. Maybe you should take a heater with you." Emily just smiled to herself, brushing off the comments. She wasn't going to let their doubts stop her. She had made up her mind, and nothing could change that. When the day finally came to leave, Emily packed her things into her small car and set off on the long drive. The journey was harder than she expected, with snow starting to fall as she drove further away from the city. The landscape began to change as she moved deeper into the wilderness. There were no longer any signs of civilization, just endless fields of white snow and dark, looming trees. The cold crept into her car, no matter how much she turned up the heat. She was nervous, but she also felt a strange sense of excitement. It was like she was stepping into a different world, one that she had only read about in books or seen in movies. The closer she got to the cabin, the more isolated she felt. There were no other cars on the road, no houses, no signs of life. The feeling of being alone in the wilderness was overwhelming, but Emily couldn't turn back now. After hours of driving, she finally reached the area where the cabin was supposed to be. The road was narrow and covered in snow, barely visible under the thick blanket of white. Emily could barely see the road signs or anything in the distance. It was like driving through a frozen fog. She wasn't sure if she was going the right way, but the letter from Aunt Clara was her only guide. She had no choice but to keep going. Eventually, through the haze of snow, Emily saw the outline of a small structure ahead. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it was the cabin. She pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car, her boots sinking into the deep snow. The wind howled around her, and she pulled her coat tighter around her body, shivering from the cold. The cabin looked old but sturdy, surrounded by a quiet emptiness. It was like something out of a fairy tale, a small, rustic home standing alone in a vast white world. Emily's breath clouded in front of her as she stepped closer to the door, wondering what she would find inside. This was it, the start of something completely new. She wasn't sure what she would discover here, but she knew that Aunt Clara's legacy, and maybe even her own, was waiting for her inside that cabin. The wind howled through the trees as Emily approached the cabin. The cold was unbearable, the air so frigid that it almost felt like it could freeze your breath in midair. She took a deep breath and stepped out of her car, the crunch of the snow beneath her boots echoing through the vast emptiness around her. The wind bit at her face, and she wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, pulling her jacket collar higher to block out the cold. The first thing that struck Emily was the silence. There were no birds, no animals, no sounds of people or vehicles, just the wind and the snow. It was as though the world had been frozen in time, suspended in a never-ending winter. The snowflakes swirled around her, dancing in the air before landing on the ground, covering everything in a soft, thick layer of white. Emily couldn't help but feel small in the face of such vastness. The landscape stretched out in every direction, nothing but white snow and dark, leafless trees. There was no sign of life, no sign of anything. The idea of surviving in such a place seemed impossible, yet here she was, standing alone in the middle of the wilderness. The relatives had laughed at her decision, calling her crazy for even considering this journey. But now, standing here in the midst of the frozen wasteland, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The world was so different here, so raw and untouched. She glanced at the cabin again. It was small, made of old wood with a slanted roof covered in snow. The windows were dark, and there was a faint smell of wood and dust in the air. Despite its weathered appearance, it stood strong against the harsh environment, as though it had been built to withstand whatever the elements could throw at it. As Emily walked toward the cabin, she noticed how quiet it was, almost too quiet. The wind was the only sound, and even that seemed muffled by the thick blanket of snow. The cabin looked deserted, yet somehow inviting. There was a small porch with a couple of old chairs covered in snow, and a single light flickered dimly from the window, casting a weak glow in the dark. She paused for a moment to take it all in. The journey had been long and difficult, and Emily was tired. The drive through the snow-covered roads had been exhausting. There were moments when she doubted whether she was even on the right path, but now, standing in front of the cabin, she felt a strange sense of peace. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for her arrival. Her heart raced as she reached for the door. The cold metal of the doorknob felt like ice against her skin, and she hesitated for a moment. What would she find inside? What had Aunt Clara's life been like in this frozen world? With a deep breath, Emily turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked as the door swung inward, revealing the interior of the cabin. The air inside was musty, with the faint smell of old wood and dust. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, maps, and old photographs. There was a fireplace in the corner, its stone chimney rising high above the room, and a couple of chairs sat near the fire, waiting for someone to sit in them. Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her, grateful to be out of the cold. The warmth of the cabin was a welcome relief, and she took off her heavy coat, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the various objects that filled the space. It was clear that Aunt Clara had lived here alone for many years. The cabin was small, but cozy. The walls were decorated with old photographs of landscapes. some of which Emily recognized as places near where the cabin was located. There were also several maps pinned to the wall, each one showing the surrounding areas, the mountains, the rivers, and the endless stretch of wilderness. As Emily walked further into the cabin, she noticed a small table in the center of the room. There was a single chair at the table, and a stack of letters sat beside it, covered in dust. The letters looked old, and the paper was yellowed with age. Emily picked one up and noticed that the handwriting was familiar. It was Aunt Clara's. She sat down at the table and began to read. The letters were filled with stories about Clara's life in the wilderness. Some of the stories were about survival, how she had built the cabin herself, how she had learned to survive in the freezing temperatures, how she had learned to hunt and fish and gather food from the land. There were also stories about the people Clara had met along the way, other survivors who had found their way to the same harsh environment, creating a small community of like-minded individuals. As Emily read through the letters, she began to understand the complexity of her aunt's life. Aunt Clara had not just been a recluse, as Emily's relatives had thought. She had chosen this life, and she had made it work. The letters spoke of loneliness, but also of peace and satisfaction. Clara had found a way to thrive in the harshest conditions, and in her own way, she had found happiness in the frozen wasteland. Emily felt a mix of emotions as she read. She had always thought of her aunt as strange, even a little mad for choosing such an isolated life. But now, as she read Clara's words, she felt a deep sense of admiration. Clara had been brave. She had built a life in a place where most people would never even consider going. And now Emily was here, standing in the same cabin, trying to understand the woman her aunt had become. It was clear that Aunt Clara had left something behind for Emily. It wasn't just the cabin, it was the knowledge, the skills, and the wisdom that Clara had gathered over the years. Emily felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She wasn't just here to inherit a cabin. She was here to learn from the life her aunt had lived. But the question was, could Emily survive here? Could she live in such a harsh and unforgiving environment? She had never done anything like this before. The cold, the isolation, the difficulty of surviving, these were all things she had never faced. But something inside her told her that she could. Something inside her told her that this cabin, this life, might be the answer to something she had been looking for. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and Emily sat back in the chair, staring into the flames. Outside, the wind howled, but inside she felt safe. She had made the decision to come here, and now she would see it through. There was no turning back. She was going to learn about her aunt's life and find out if she, too, could survive in this frozen wasteland. The days passed slowly as Emily settled into the cabin. The wind outside was constant, howling through the trees, but inside the cabin it was peaceful. Emily had spent the first few days simply adjusting to the isolation. She had set up a small bed by the fireplace and organized her things, but there was so much about the cabin that she still didn't understand. It was as though Aunt Clara had lived in another world, one Emily had only heard of in stories, not something she had ever imagined herself being a part of. Each morning, Emily would wake up early and start a fire in the fireplace. The cold seemed to seep into every crack and corner of the cabin, and it was hard to feel warm without the fire roaring. As the fire crackled and filled the room with heat, she would sit down at the small table and begin reading through Aunt Clara's letters. The more she read, the more Emily realized that her aunt was far more than a simple woman who had decided to live alone in the middle of nowhere. Clara had been a woman of strength, someone who had learned to thrive in the harshest of environments. Aunt Clara's letters told a story of survival. They spoke of her struggles and triumphs, of how she had learned to adapt to the freezing cold and unpredictable weather. The more Emily read, the more she began to understand that living here wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about mastering it. Aunt Clara had learned to build a life in the wilderness, creating a safe, comfortable space out of nothing but raw materials from the land. The cabin itself was a testament to Clara's resourcefulness. Emily noticed that the walls were made from thick, sturdy logs, and the floors were smooth, polished wood. There was a certain elegance to the design, even though it was so simple. Clara had made the cabin her own, each piece of furniture and decoration carefully chosen, each object placed with purpose. Emily began to realize that the cabin wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a reflection of her aunt's life and values. As Emily continued reading, she learned more about Aunt Clara's routine. Every day, Clara would leave the cabin to gather firewood, hunt for food, and gather whatever materials she could find to keep herself alive. There was no electricity out here, no running water. Clara had relied on the natural world for everything. She had learned to read the weather, to understand the signs of the land, to know when it was safe to go out and when it was too dangerous. She had built her life around the rhythms of nature, and Emily began to admire her aunt for that. One day, as Emily was reading through another one of Clara's letters, she came across something that caught her attention. In the letter, Clara mentioned a hidden cave nearby, a place where she had once taken refuge during a particularly fierce storm. It was a place Clara had never told anyone about, not even her family. According to the letter, the cave was deep in the wilderness, hidden behind thick layers of snow and ice. Clara had found it by accident, and over time it had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape from the world and find peace. Curious, Emily decided to find the cave. It seemed like the next step in understanding her aunt's life. Clara had left her this cabin for a reason, and Emily felt she needed to explore every corner of it to uncover the truth. The cave might hold the answers to questions she didn't even know she had. The next morning, Emily bundled up in her warmest clothes and packed a small bag with essentials, water, food, and a flashlight. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew the journey wouldn't be easy. She left the cabin and stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she made her way toward the forest. The wind whipped at her face, and the snow seemed to fall even harder, as if nature itself were trying to push her back. But Emily pressed on, determined to find the cave. As she walked deeper into the forest, the landscape began to change. The trees grew thicker and the snow piled higher, making it more difficult to move. Emily struggled to keep her balance as she trudged through the deep snow, her legs growing tired with each step. The wind howled, but there was something oddly comforting about the sound. It was as though the wilderness was speaking to her, guiding her along the way. After several hours of walking, Emily began to feel the weight of the journey. She hadn't expected it to be this hard, but the cold was starting to seep into her bones, and her legs were aching. She was about to turn back when she noticed something in the distance, a dark shadow against the white snow. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but as she got closer, she realized it was a cave entrance, half hidden behind a thick layer of snow and ice. Her heart raced with excitement. This was it, the cave Aunt Clara had mentioned in her letters. Emily approached the entrance carefully, making sure to watch her step. The cave was small, but it seemed deep, and as she entered, she was hit by a wave of cool air. The inside of the cave was dark, but the faint light from outside illuminated the walls, revealing the jagged rock formations that lined the cave's interior. As Emily ventured deeper into the cave, she could see signs that Clara had been here many times. The ground was covered in small patches of moss, and there were old blankets and pillows scattered around, evidence that Clara had used the space as a refuge. It was clear that this cave had been a place of comfort for her aunt, a place where she could escape from the harshness of the world outside. The deeper Emily went, the more she felt a connection to her aunt. Clara had spent so much time here, and now so was Emily. The cave was a silent witness to the challenges Clara had faced, and it felt like a sacred space, a place where Emily could begin to understand the strength and resilience her aunt had possessed. As Emily sat down on one of the blankets, she reflected on the letters and the life her aunt had lived. Clara had not just survived in the wilderness, she had embraced it. She had built a life here in the cold, in the isolation, finding peace and purpose in the very place that others would have called a wasteland. Emily realized that Aunt Clara had been more than just a recluse. She had been a pioneer, someone who had chosen to live a life that few could ever imagine, and now Emily was beginning to see the wisdom in it. The cave was a turning point for Emily. It wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about understanding the land, connecting with it, and embracing the solitude. She could feel Aunt Clara's presence all around her, in the blankets, in the worn paths, in the stories of survival that filled the letters. Clara had left her this inheritance not just for the cabin, but for the life it represented, a life of strength, resilience, and connection to the land. As the wind howled outside, Emily sat in the cave, feeling a sense of peace. She wasn't alone here. Clara's spirit, her wisdom, and her strength were with her, guiding her through the wilderness. Emily knew that she had a long journey ahead, but for the first time she felt ready. This was her new life, and she would make it her own. Emily had been living in the cabin for almost 2 weeks now. Each day, she grew more comfortable with the rhythms of life in the wilderness. The cold no longer felt like an enemy but a constant companion. She had learned how to maintain the fire, how to gather firewood in the woods, and how to ration the food she had brought with her. The tasks, though tiring, became a routine. She found peace in the quiet, and there was a certain clarity in the solitude that she had never experienced before. Still, there was something nagging at the back of her mind, a question that had been lingering since she first set foot in the cabin. What would her relatives say when they eventually saw this place? They had laughed at her decision to come here, calling her crazy, thinking she wouldn't last a day in such a harsh environment. They had mocked her for even considering staying in a place like this, isolated and cold. They couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live here. But now, as Emily spent more time in the cabin, she couldn't help but wonder, how would they react when they saw the reality of what Aunt Clara had created here? Would they still laugh? Or would they see the truth behind her aunt's choice and understand the strength it had taken to build a life in this frozen wasteland? It wasn't long before her relatives showed up, as Emily had expected. They had taken their time, probably thinking that Emily would have given up by now. But when they arrived, they were shocked by what they found. The first to arrive were her parents, who had been the most vocal about her decision to come. They had insisted that she was making a mistake, that no one could survive in a place like this. They had called her foolish, and Emily had almost expected them to be right. But now, as they pulled up to the cabin, the looks on their faces were anything but smug. Her mother, who had once laughed at the thought of Emily living here, stood frozen in place when she stepped out of the car. She looked at the cabin, then at the snow-covered landscape around them, and then back at Emily. Her eyes were wide and her mouth was slightly open, as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her father, usually a man of few words, simply shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe you're actually living here," he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of awe and confusion. "This place, it's unreal." Emily couldn't help but smile, though it was a small one. She had expected their reaction, but there was a part of her that still felt a bit of satisfaction. They had underestimated her. They had laughed, but now, standing here in front of the cabin, they had no choice but to admit that Emily had done something they thought was impossible. "We came to see for ourselves," her mother said, finally breaking the silence. "But I didn't think you'd actually last out here. This is unbelievable." Emily's smile faded slightly as she realized that her parents hadn't come just to visit. They had come with their doubts, expecting to find her struggling, cold, and regretful. They had expected to find her packing up, ready to leave. But that wasn't what they found. "Why don't you come inside?" Emily suggested, trying to keep her voice steady despite the nervous energy bubbling inside her. She opened the door and stepped aside, allowing her parents to enter first. They hesitated for a moment before stepping into the warmth of the cabin, and Emily closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold wind. The warmth of the fire hit them immediately, and her mother let out a soft sigh of relief. Emily could see the change in her parents' expressions as they took in the interior of the cabin. They had been expecting something dark and cold, a space filled with dust and neglect. But instead, the cabin was warm, inviting, and surprisingly well kept. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow over the room. The shelves were filled with books, photographs, and maps, reminders of Aunt Clara's life in this remote place. The air smelled faintly of wood and the outdoors, but there was also the unmistakable scent of the fire, warm and comforting. Her mother sat down in one of the chairs by the fire, her hands rubbing together to warm up. "I didn't expect it to be so cozy," she admitted, her voice soft. "It's actually kind of nice in here." Emily nodded, feeling a little more at ease now that her parents were no longer mocking her. They weren't laughing anymore, they weren't even complaining. They were simply trying to understand. Her father walked around the room, his hands running over the wooden furniture, inspecting the craftsmanship. "You've really settled in, haven't you?" he said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and disbelief. "Your aunt must have been something else to make a life here like this." Emily's heart warmed at his words. It was the first time he had acknowledged the strength it took to survive here. She had hoped they would see Aunt Clara's legacy for what it truly was, not just a cabin in the middle of nowhere, but a testament to resilience, resourcefulness, and strength. Her parents' attitude had shifted, but it wasn't just because they were cold or uncomfortable. There was something deeper now, something unspoken, a growing understanding that they had underestimated not just Emily, but Aunt Clara too. They stayed for several hours, talking, looking around, and getting to know the place that had become Emily's new home. As they spoke, Emily could sense their curiosity growing. They weren't asking the same questions they had before, the ones laced with mockery. Now they were genuinely interested in the cabin and in Aunt Clara's life. They wanted to know more. As the afternoon wore on, Emily's cousins arrived. Like her parents, they had been skeptical of her decision to live here, laughing and teasing her about the crazy life she had chosen. But now, as they stood in the cabin, their laughter had died down. They were quiet, looking around, taking in the details of the space. They were the ones who had laughed the loudest, but now they stood in silence, unsure of what to say. After a while, one of her cousins, Josh, finally spoke up. "I've got to admit," he said slowly, "this place is kind of incredible. I didn't think anyone could live here, let alone make it work. You've really shown us something, Emily." His words were the last piece of the puzzle. Emily had come to prove to herself that she could do it, that she could survive, thrive, and make this place her own. But now she realized that she had also proved something to her family. They had laughed, but now they were seeing the truth. They were seeing the cabin for what it truly was, a testament to the strength of the woman who had built it, and a reflection of the strength Emily was beginning to realize she had within herself. The days after her relatives left were peaceful, but something inside Emily had changed. For the first time since she arrived, she could feel a deep sense of belonging in the cabin. She no longer saw it as just a place to escape or as a challenge she needed to overcome. It had become her sanctuary, a place where she felt safe and alive. The cold outside, which once seemed so overwhelming, no longer felt like an enemy. Instead, it was a constant reminder of the strength she had discovered in herself. When her relatives had left, they had done so with respect. There were no more jokes or mockery. They had seen the cabin for what it truly was, not just an isolated place in the middle of nowhere, but a symbol of survival, resilience, and independence. Emily's parents, who had once doubted her ability to live here, had apologized, though quietly and without words. They didn't need to say anything. They understood now. They had seen her aunt's legacy and understood that it wasn't just about surviving in a harsh environment. It was about embracing it, adapting to it, and finding peace in the most unlikely of places. But the real change came when Emily woke up one morning just after a heavy snowfall. She stepped outside into the crisp, clear air, and for the first time she realized that she was no longer a visitor in this place. She had become a part of it. The vast, empty landscape with its white snow and frozen trees no longer felt alien or cold. It felt like home. The morning light reflected off the snow, casting a soft glow across the wilderness. The silence was deep and absolute, broken only by the crunch of Emily's boots in the snow. She took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, icy air, and felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. This was where she belonged. This place, this frozen wasteland, had become a part of her, just as much as she had become a part of it. She realized that this was the inheritance her aunt had left her, not just a cabin, but a life. A life that was challenging, yes, but also full of meaning and purpose. Over the next few days, Emily threw herself into making the cabin her own. She began by cleaning out the old woodpile and organizing the supplies. Her aunt had left behind an impressive collection of tools, each one carefully chosen for its specific purpose. Emily felt a deep appreciation for the life her aunt had led, and as she worked, she felt closer to her. It was as if Aunt Clara was right there with her, guiding her every step of the way. The fire crackled in the hearth as Emily rearranged the furniture. She moved a few things around, added some of her own personal touches, and began to feel the cabin take on a new life. It wasn't just a place where she was surviving anymore. It was a place where she was thriving. As the days passed, Emily found herself learning more about the land around her. She had always been interested in nature, but now, living in it, she began to understand it in a way she never had before. She started to recognize the signs of weather changes, the way the wind shifted direction before a storm, the way animals moved in the snow. It was as if the land had its own language, and Emily was slowly learning how to speak it. One afternoon, as Emily walked along the edge of the forest, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. A small family of deer was grazing nearby, their breath visible in the cold air. They moved gracefully through the snow, undisturbed by Emily's presence. For the first time since she had arrived, Emily felt a deep connection to the animals, to the land, to the life she had chosen. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living in harmony with the world around her. She smiled to herself, realizing that this was what Aunt Clara had meant when she talked about finding peace in the wilderness. It wasn't just about enduring the cold or surviving the harshness of the environment. It was about learning to live with it, to find beauty in the simplicity of the snow-covered trees, the quiet of the forest, and the endless sky above. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's confidence grew. She learned how to fish in the frozen lake, how to track animals in the snow, and how to build traps for food. Each day brought new challenges, but they no longer felt like obstacles. They felt like opportunities to learn, to grow, and to become a part of something bigger than herself. In the evenings, when the fire was low and the cabin was warm, Emily would sit by the window and look out over the snowy landscape. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, she had never even imagined herself living here. Now, it felt like this place had been waiting for her all along. The cold, the isolation, the challenges, none of it seemed so overwhelming anymore. Emily had found a new strength within herself, one that was rooted in the land and in the lessons she had learned from Aunt Clara. The more she settled into this life, the more she understood why Aunt Clara had chosen it. The solitude wasn't a burden, it was a gift. It allowed her to think, to reflect, to become in tune with herself and the world around her. The wilderness wasn't something to be feared or avoided. It was a place to be embraced, a place that had its own rhythm and pace. It was a place where she could find peace, even in the midst of the harshest conditions. One morning, as Emily walked out onto the porch of the cabin, she stopped and looked out at the horizon. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the snow-covered landscape. She could see the mountain peaks in the distance, their tops shrouded in mist, and the sky above was a brilliant blue with only a few wisps of cloud. In that moment, Emily realized that she had found her true home. It wasn't just the cabin or the land, it was the life she had created for herself. It was the peace she had found in the silence, the strength she had discovered in the cold, and the deep connection she felt to the world around her. She was no longer just surviving in the wasteland, she was thriving. The inheritance Aunt Clara had left her was more than just a cabin. It was a way of life, and now Emily knew that she was ready to carry it forward. She had become a part of the wilderness just as Aunt Clara had. And she would continue to live here in harmony with the land for as long as she could. The relatives who had once laughed at her were long gone, but Emily no longer needed their approval. She had found something far more valuable, peace, purpose, and a life she could call her own. The frozen wasteland was no longer a place of isolation and fear. It was a place of opportunity, a place where she could continue to grow, learn, and live in a way that was true to herself. As Emily stood on the porch, looking out at the vast, snow-covered land before her, she smiled. This was her new life. And she was ready to embrace it completely.